gentlemen, thank you for being here with our program today. I'm very honored today to have a wonderful author. He has written 5 books, and I'm sure he's written tons of other smaller materials and short stories. Francisco Troncoso, we're talking to him right now as he's back east. I'm in California.
Sergio Troncoso.
Weather. And thank you. Thank you for correcting me. And, just you're very well known. You've been sort of appearing in a lot of articles because of your stance in Latinos, in immigration. I know that your books also highlight that: The Last Tortilla, The Other Stories, The Nature of Truth, Crossing Borders, From This Wicked Patch to Dust. I like that title. And Our Lost Borders. So these are a series of some of your books that are out there. Tell us, how did you become a writer?
Well, I grew up in Isleta, which is on the east side of El Paso, Texas. And Isleta is this very ancient community built in probably the 1680s. The Isleta Mission is built in the 1680s, and it was more or less a colonia at that time. When I was growing up in Isleta, my parents built their own adobe house, and I started, listening to what was around me. Everybody from my abuelita on my mother's side, listening to stories about Francisco Villa. Her family were Villistas, and she had a couple of brothers who died with Villa. And then on my father's side, I had my grandfather, my father's father, who was editor and publisher of El Día, one of the first daily newspaper in Juarez in the 1920s. So I think I was getting different kinds of influences from my family, but I loved to read as a kid in Isleta. It was a poor community, but I would amass all these small paperback books from Scholastic, hundreds of them, because that's what I could afford. And so I was this chubby kid who loved to read.
The idea that you're reading, how was that accepted by your peers? Because, we don't normally think of a lot of Latinos being major readers and in promoting education in the sense that, wow, this is fantastic. Did you find a conflict with your peers?
Well, in Isleta, sometimes I did, but sometimes I didn't. It depends on the peer. There were certainly many readers in my community. There were, a few, a lot of my friends who were girls loved to read. That actually is still true. Women buy the majority of books. That's always been true for a long time, and it was true in Isleta. So there were boys who also liked to read, but that was also, I would say, a little bit uncommon. The more popular people were the football players and the cheerleaders, and the people who were tough and chingones. And I was kind of a nerd, a fat kind of kid who loved to read and a little nerdish, but I was also strong in character. It didn't really matter to me that other people were doing what I was doing or weren't doing what I was doing, and I didn't really care. I loved to be by myself. I loved to amass my collection of little paperback books, and that's who I was. And I didn't give a crap about what other people believed or wanted to do. And I think any kid who's a little bit nerdy and maybe you don't fit in quite well, you keep that nerdiness going. Because your mind is another muscle. When your mind gets tough and strong, you go beyond Isleta. You go beyond wherever you want to be, and do amazing things. And I think that would be a message I would tell a lot of kids. If you stick out like a sore thumb, you find your place. You find your quiet sanctuary, whether it's a public library or you have parents like I did who didn't really understand. I think my mother was a reader, but my father was, more of a doer. He worked very hard, but I didn't see him read a lot. But my mother was reading Selecciones from Reader's Digest. She loved reading El Fronterizo. She would read the El Paso Times, and I think all of this, helped me in many ways to become a reader first, and then later a writer.
One of the things, I grew up in Tijuana, and I went to school on the American side every day. But one of the things that I realized right away, that people who lived on the American side had access to all the books and novels in Spanish, and they read a lot for that reason. As you got further into the United States, it was at that time less and less literature choices. But if you live in the border, people had books. They're just in Spanish, but whatever you could find in English, you could practically find in Spanish. And so people who live along the border like yourself, reading El Periódico on the Mexican side, and they were getting their news. So I could see that influencing you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw that primarily through my mother, who, she would get all the Mexican newspapers in El Paso. You could buy them in El Paso stores. You didn't have to go to Juarez to buy them. And she was a reader. She was reading in Spanish, and I would read in Spanish, but I preferred English. And every public library, in fact, the Isleta Public Library, which is the best thing that happened to me over the last year, is that the local public library was named after me.
Oh, wow.
The library branch. And so in October 2nd, I'm going for the official renaming ceremony of the Sergio Troncoso Branch Library.
Felicidades.
Yeah, but that library has as many titles in Spanish as it does in English, because that's the community. Puros mexicanos, and not Chicanos, not Hispanic, son mexicanos que acaban de cruzar. People who their parents are Mexicanos. The kids may be first generation, maybe more bilingual, and then by the second or third generation, they're more Mexican American.
Sure.
And así es el caso,
I always found most of my education was in English. I found Spanish very easy to read. Once you get the phonetics and you can speak it, reading is just super easy. So you can read a lot more in Spanish, at least I can, than in English. But this whole aspect. Is there a common theme? No, your books are never the same, but is there sort of a general common theme that runs through your books?
I think the common theme is border crossings. And that means more than just geographical borders, more than just Mexico to the U.S. It means linguistic borders, Spanish to English. It means psychological and philosophical borders. It means opening your mind to other people who often maybe you would dismiss. Like, for example, some of the poorest people I knew in Isleta were sometimes the most moral people in that I knew, and yet people wouldn't give them a chance porque son pobres, or they assume they don't have anything to say or nothing intelligent to discuss because they come from a poor neighborhood. And I think I would see that repeatedly all the time, not just with people in my neighborhood, but let's say I would say, well, I would tell people I'm Chicano, I'm Mexicano, and I'm at Yale, and they would just assume all sorts of things because of that identity. And I think, I am certainly an evangelist for getting people to open their minds and cross that border to whatever other side that is, to be empathetic. Empathy, I think, is so crucial for any writer, for anyone who's curious about the world and wants to pay attention to what's in front of him. And I think as we get older, we get less empathetic. We start assuming, oh, yeah, I understand what Latinos are, or I understand what immigrants are, or I understand what, it goes further, African Americans or Jews or whatever. And I think we don't. I think you need to engage, and that goes for every group we talk about. So I think border crossings in many ways is a theme that runs through all my work. And it's more than just geographical borders. It's all sorts of borders that I cross myself.
What I'm getting from you is not the idea so much that we think of people crossing the border towards us, but we take decisions to also cross borders into other locations and then keep our eyes and our attention open, and then sort of pick up their culture, their perspective, without having all these filters that it's right or wrong. Am I picking that up?
I think that's true. I mean, I believe that you should pick and choose the best practices of wherever you are from and wherever you go. So, for example, one of the things that I love about Isleta is that the people are honest and they're straight and they don't give you bullshit. I love that my parents taught me the immigrant value of hard work until you drop, get up and work again, y no te dejes. That kind of feistiness I got from my abuelita, la revolucionaria, that kind of force of working until you drop, but I translated it into intellectual work, not, let's say, putting drywall on the, on my in my room. And so, although I did learn how to drywall from my father, but those values I kept. Some of the values I criticize are, for example, machismo. This idea, the biggest clashes I had with my father were about sort of his authoritarianism, his I believe not being somewhat fair, with women, and I think you go as you go through life and you cross borders. My wife, for example, is Jewish, and I met her at Harvard, and we have more in common in many ways in terms of being muy aliados a la familia, with family, than I think I had with so many other people that were Latinos, quote unquote. My parents get along better with my Jewish wife than they get along with me, because as they say, Laura es muy suavecita and you're muy carajo. And yet Laura will sit with my parents, and by the way, my wife is fluent in Spanish and Portuguese, so she talks to them in Spanish. She goes to Isleta and sits on their porch and had la hora social, drinking coffee and talking with my parents for hours. I couldn't stand it. I always wanted to go and do something. So, she crossed borders too. And so you make alliances with people who are of similar minds. But you can find those alliances in many cultures, many religions, and you just have to be open-minded. And I think we also have to be brave enough as Latinos to say, this practice in the Latino community, or this machismo, or whatever, this sexism, we can't stand up for, we can't stand for that. We have to criticize that. We have to mejorarnos, and so that's what I'm talking about. Not just people crossing to pay attention and care about us, but also we changing our own culture for the better. And that's not a matter of disrespect. It's simply a matter of confidence in who we are.
Well, I'd like to share for the benefit of the viewers that, there's huge Jewish communities in Mexico, number one. And a lot of people are actually Jewish. They don't even know it because of the Inquisition time. So there's a lot of people from the areas of Chihuahua who are actually from Jewish backgrounds, and they don't even know it.
Absolutely.
So when we think of, we don't want to compartmentalize and say Latinos versus Jews or something. There's no such a thing. We're all
Ilan Stavans wrote the intro to my first book, The Last Tortilla and Other Stories, and he's a Mexican Jew, and he has a very ancient community in Mexico. Yeah. My sister, just to throw in another loop, my sister, a Chicana from El Paso, converted and became Muslim about 30 some years ago or so. And so in my family, my families are Judíos, I'm Musulmanes, and my parents Christian Catholic. So as I tell people when I give talks across the country, I'd be the perfect mayor of Jerusalem.
No, absolutely. Like I said, when I lived in Tijuana, there was a synagogue down the street. And the people says, what is it doing here? Says, what do you mean? I mean, we have all the religions here. There's major areas still of Mormons, obviously, Rusos.
Right.
Everybody knew they were there. It was just always very international. So I don't know where people were surprised of that, the whole idea. What advice do you give to persons who are considering or are starting off to be writers?
Be a reader. If you're not a reader, you're never going to be a writer. And that means not just, certainly I start with Latino literature and many of the writers that I know and writing about my community, but you also expand beyond that to Russian writers, Chinese writers, writers in other languages. For example, Latin America. I mean, I lived in Mexico, and during that year, I only read Octavio Paz, Mario Vargas Llosa, Isabel Allende, all in Spanish. I mean, there is a Borges. There's a treasure trove of Latin American literature. So knowing Spanish is so important to expanding your imagination and becoming a writer. So I think that's the first advice I would give to any would-be writer. The other thing is it takes time to improve. You need to be writing. You need to be trying out stories and essays. and then showing them to people and getting feedback, and not just to your family and friends, not just to your tios or your mama, but to people who are professional writers or taking workshops, or maybe even becoming a graduate student, like in a master in fine arts, and getting professional feedback and developing your own aesthetic for being a writer. And it takes time. It's not an overnight success kind of thing. Well, I think the best writers are persistent, and I am always trying to improve as a writer. I certainly don't feel that, oh, I know what it is to write a novel. In fact, I've written a couple of novels, and every time I write a new novel, I'm working on one now, I'm playing with form, I'm playing with time, I'm trying to teach myself things that I feel I need to learn. So I think this long process of being a lifelong learner, of looking at your own weaknesses, and then getting better at those weaknesses, and then finding out other weaknesses and working on those, whether it's dialogue, whether it's setting, whether it's characterization. And so the more you do that, the more you will take those steps to becoming a good writer.
Somebody once told me, recently says, to be successful, you have to be uncomfortable being uncomfortable. Where you're constantly having to move, change. You're never finished, if you will. Everything's always evolving. Sounds to me that that's what you're sort of sharing, that, you never finish. It's always sort of a work in progress.
Absolutely. I think any writer worth his or her salt is not just uncomfortable, but they're challenging themselves. And, you are your own worst critic. And I think you have to be an honest critic. I tell people, be critical, but don't be self-destructive. That's what I tell my workshop students. You have to be critical. You have to look at yourself and your own writing so that you take it apart, but then you have to see what you're doing right to build from that. And then also what you need to learn to get rid of that and redo it so that it's better. And that's hard to develop, that kind of critical rewriting mentality. Too often, as I tell my own kids, and I'm very tough on my kids, I have an 18-year-old and a 21-year-old. I said, most writers think they fart gold, and they don't. That everything they write is just gold dust, and they don't. And I think you have to be very, duro with your own work primarily, and learn from it.
What was that again? You have to be critical of yourself, but not self-destructive of yourself.
Exactly.
Wow. I never heard that one. That one's brand new to me. That one's a gem. I'm going to have to remember that one.
Sergio Troncoso told you. Remember that.
That's it. Where can our viewers locate you in terms of finding out information about your current work and future upcomings and presentations and workshops that I'm sure you do?
Well, I have a very active website. It's just my name, sergiotroncoso.com, or sergiotroncoso.com if you know English better. And it's just, if you know my name.
That's the New Haven side to you.
Right. But, and so you can find me there. I have everything from radio interviews, newspaper stories. I have short stories, all sorts of essays available at Twitter as well, and Facebook, and I'd love to have interaction with readers, which I do almost every week. I do a lot of Skype calls across the country.
Fantastic. We want to also acknowledge Marcela Landres, who put me in contact with you, and she immediately said, you got to talk to Sergio. So I want to thank her for acknowledging.
I love Marcela. She's a terrific resource for the Latino community.
Oh my gosh, she is just always on top of it. She does not hesitate to sort of pass on people information. So I want to thank her for that. Always. Sergio, I want to thank you for being on our program. I wish you continual success over at Yale. And one of these days we'll talk how you go from Harvard to Yale, but we'll leave that one alone because I don't want to get into a battle for that one.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Armando, to your program.
Oh, no, it's our honor. Anytime, please. And again, ladies and gentlemen, we are having the honor today of interviewing Sergio Troncoso. And we wish you luck to your family. May you continue your pen writing and write many, many more and continue to influence all of us. But I want to particularly highlight the idea that you post the information, that we're not limited to the idea that we're talking only Latinos and Latino migration and border. We're talking global extracting from our own background experiences. And I want to thank you for that. That one is very precious perspective. And thank you. Y a la próxima.
Hasta luego.
Ándale. Adiós.
Adiós.